So this is my presentation for independent study in math this year. I did mine with Sam Aronson. Um, I think math is probably not a great nomer for it. What we ended up doing ended up much more historical and philosophical, but it had definitely had its roots in logic and philosophy of mathematics and language. So I guess the way I would broadly describe our year was we did a broad survey historically of all of the attempts by philosophers to formalize notions of truth, of meaning, of synonymy, and attempts to take this mathematical rigor that was developed throughout human history and apply it to our human, messy, imperfect language. It, well, I'll just go through it. Um, the first person we looked at was Aristotle, and we looked at some mathematical formal logic. Aristotle was the first to really bring about notions of, the truth of a sentence, being dependent on containment of sets. That was one of his big notions. It was a big step in starting to formalize sentences like all whales are blue, for example. See, these very simple, mathematically rigorous sentences where we can point at a set of whales, see if they're blue. And so this gave rise to theories of logic and language. So one example is sentential logic, where you would have a sentence like all whales are blue. You can look at the sets that they invoke. You can process this with rigor. You have logical connectors like and or an or, and these would be well defined, but as it pertains to human language, there would be some ambiguities. An example could be the King of France is bald. So here we have the King of France is bald. This seems like an all whales are blue situation, but again, trying to put words onto these formally defined logical connectors is failing us, because the King of France is bald could mean that there is exactly one King of France and he happens to be bald. Or you could say that whoever the King of France is, as part of the job of being the King of France, you are bald. That is just, it is a statement of the post of King of France and not of the person. So, even at the beginning, I think there were, rumblings that, not rumblings, it was clear that this would not cover all the sentences we want. It would not, as rigorous as it was, and one thing Sam and I did is study these rigorous structures, and or we went through formal logical proofs. It would not suffice to resolve the problem of human language. It would not resolve the problem of me saying, okay, I know it when I see it, but how do I formalize it? I know it when I see it. I know what a dog is when I see one, but I've never, ran into a situation where my definition of dog might get challenged. And, could I really define dog right now? Probably not. So this made way for some more sophisticated projects in the 20th century to formalize language. This comes after the set theory that humans had intuitively been working with for a long time was finally put on fully rigorous legs with Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. This is after the incompleteness theorems, whereby we realize axioms are not going to be a panacea. And so the new project is we have some rigorous framework with which to study our language, and now let's try and navigate the broad and messy plane that is human language. So there were two large works that Sam and I looked at as part of this. The first was Two Dogmas of Empiricism by Quine. The second is Philosophical Investigations, the first 100 sections or so by Ludwig Wittgenstein. And both of these try and ultimately fail and come to the conclusion that, they try to formalize human language, talk about the project of formalizing human language, and they both conclude that in some way it's going to be impossible. So just to set up these two results, there are some notions that a formal language should really be able to satisfy. There's some things that are so intuitive to us that they should be contained in any formalization of language. The first is a notion of analyticity. And analyticity, I'll describe this in terms of a you know it when you see it situation. An analytic statement would be all unmarried men are bachelors. And this feels like a definitional thing. And that would not be the case with, all unmarried men are blue. That is a sentence where you'd have to go out and look in the world if you would like to prove this statement. Whereas the first should be a tautology. So that is one thing, that's like a hallmark problem. And like if a formalization of language can do that, then maybe it's a good idea. Maybe this is a good formalization. Another thing that is so intuitive that we must insist that our formalization of language can do this, we would like to be able to put on strong legs the idea that we can name single objects. It's one of the simplest things we do as humans. We want to say, okay, one object, one name for it. This is a dog. I would like to be able to quantify what I mean when I say this is a dog, under what circumstances I think something is a dog, how when I converse with people we can mean dog in the same way. So those are two things, those are two benchmark problems of this project. And let's go through the Quine first. Quine tries to talk about notions of analyticity. He is tackling this first issue, and he attacks it from many of the cutting-edge theories of the day. One of them is a theory of truth where you could say, all right, all unmarried men are bachelors. I consider this statement analytic because unmarried man and bachelor are synonyms. They're interchangeable. They're defined in terms of each other. And so when I put them in the same sentence like that with the connector is, which we can all agree on is meaning, we can say that this statement is a tautology, it's analytic. He goes on to say that trying to think of analyticity in terms of synonymy, when you say analytic sentences are sentences that are tautological by, interchanging two synonymous words, like all unmarried men are bachelors are, you'll run into some problems. His counterexample is, how about the sentence, bachelor has fewer than 10 letters? There's a sentence that's just limit testing, unmarried man does not have fewer than 10 letters. It's a bizarre sentence. It's not one that will come up a lot. But if you're trying to rigorously say that bachelor and unmarried man are the same word, you're never going to get that in its purest form. Our words are all really different from each other. The only word that can be interchanged with bachelor to retain the meaning of the sentences that bachelor is contained in is bachelor itself. To try and group up words based on meaning, based on synonymy, you'll end up having to shatter the entire language into just its individual words, because any two words are going to be different in some way. There are sentences in which they mean different things. So a synonymy method of attack at analyticity is not going to be rigorous. If it is rigorous, then it's very boring. It's just every word is interchangeable with itself and no other word. He tries to work around this with a notion of cognitive synonymy. He could say, okay, when I say unmarried man and when I say bachelor, what is conjured in your mind, say we're having a conversation, is the same thing. We understand each other. We mean the same thing when we say bachelor and unmarried man. It's a cognitive synonymy. We are talking about the same set of things, the same set of sentences that these two things would apply to. Bachelor has fewer than 10 letters is not at the forefront of your mind when I say bachelor. You are thinking unmarried man. His counterexample here is that you can have two clauses that are referring to the same set of things. They're referring to the same objects, and that they should be cognitively synonymous by his definition, but in fact they mean very different things. So his example is creature with a heart and creature with kidneys. Those are two things that refer to the same set of creatures. For all intents and purposes, all creatures have both hearts and kidneys. Some have neither. And so, in terms of cognitive synonymy, these two really should mean the same thing, yet when I say one in a sentence, I'm probably talking about a heart, and when I'm saying the latter in a sentence, I'm probably talking about kidneys. But, in fact, they are interchangeable in terms of, the images that are conjured in your mind when I say them. And so, interchangeability in a very rigorous sense, okay, the set of sentences where they mean these things are the same, is too restrictive and is not a very useful definition. And a more human definition of cognitive synonymy will allow some synonymies that we don't want to slip through the cracks. It's unnecessarily vague. And so the sentence necessarily all and only bachelors are unmarried men, for example, will be, true when we look at the sets of bachelors and unmarried men. If you're a bachelor, yes, necessarily you're an unmarried man. Yet, we really think that sentence should kind of be different than necessarily all creatures with hearts are creatures with kidneys. Creatures with hearts and creatures with kidneys are not really defined in terms of each other, but according to Quine's theory of cognitive synonymy, that sentence is no different from the bachelors and unmarried men. So if you come at it from either direction, in the stricter direction or the looser direction, you'll run into problems. All right, so he goes through another larger attempt to talk about cognitive synonymy that doesn't necessarily run into those problems, and it is a verification theory of meaning, which was another prominent theory when he wrote his paper in the 50s. And it goes as such. Sure, bachelors and unmarried men are the same. Creatures with kidneys and creatures with hearts are the same. But the verification theory says that the analytic statement is shown to be analytic when my method of verifying it in the real world is the same when I interchange these two words. So I say, Dan is a bachelor, Dan is an unmarried man. In order to verify those two sentences, I would do the exact same thing. I would go up to Dan and say, hey, are you married? And as it pertains to my activity, as it pertains to the world, and the way we interact with these sentences will be the same. And the verification theory does do this job. It distinguishes between the bachelors and unmarried men and the hearts and kidneys situation, because to find out if a creature has a heart, I will look for a heart, and to find out if a creature has a kidney, I will look at a kidney. This theory is attractive, but at some point you will run into a problem that's similar to our cognitive synonymy, and that is this is very intuitive as a theory, and to verify your claims you need empirical evidence. Humans' interpretations of the physical world can be different. There is no eye in the sky that can tell you the truth of certain sentences or how to verify them. There is a human vagueness in a verification theory that presents a problem that is as intractable as the analyticity problem was in the first place. There have been projects to really go all out and try to rigorize this verification theory, talking about a point in space, in three-dimensional space and time, a four-tuple of real numbers. You can talk about what kind of atom is at a certain point, so that, empirical evidence is completely rigorized and out of the eyes of humans. They try to talk about sense datum language, that, a human neurons are firing in certain ways, and if they're firing in similar ways, they'll, be doing the same thing. It's an attempt to take the empirical evidence roadblock of verification theory and try to work around it and put it on solid ground. This project is shaky at best. Quine says that this is not an acceptable proof, or that the attempts to put verification theory on solid ground are still in progress. And so we kind of don't have a satisfactory and rigorous way to say that all bachelors are unmarried men is somehow different from saying all bachelors are blue. 99% of cases, bachelors and unmarried men will mean the same thing in the sentences they're used in, but this is not a complete synonymy. It is not complete analyticity, and the messiness of human language proves too messy to put some Platonic, rigorous framework on top of. So that brings us to Wittgenstein, who kind of accepts this this imperfection of the words we use. We accept that they may be ambiguous in certain cases, and tries to slot that into a theory of what he calls language games. And language games are processes during which two people in conversation, or just in general, can come to the same understanding of words and learn a shared language. And so he talks about someone playing a game with someone else. An example could be if I sit down with you and we begin to play chess. As you play legal moves, I'll begin to realize that you are playing the same game I am. We have shared vocabulary in chess. We understand that the other knows how to play the game. And a similar thing will go on with language. A baby first learns language. They understand the words. They see that the word red is used when there are a lot of red balls around, and they'll slowly figure out that, okay, this is the rule. I use red to talk about an object that looks like this. And they'll slowly build up a vocabulary, and luckily in the case of humans and human society, this language is very, very similar to everyone else's. Some technical words, like triglyceride, will be the same almost every time they're used between people. Some words like good are going to be very different, but for the most part, our language relative to others' languages are very, very effective and help us communicate via these language games. So this is kind of a nihilistic way of looking at things. Wittgenstein doesn't really attempt to fully platonically put language on rigorous grounding, but he accepts that language will be messy and just talks about language relatively between humans. But even this theory, which is not very rigorous, not very powerful, though it does explain the phenomena we observe in human language very well, it does not give us a powerful framework with which to analyze our language rigorously. And so this takes us to our second thing we would love language to do, just as a case study, a very simple thing we'd like it to do. I want a theory of language to explain how I can name objects. One of the simplest things we do. Physical objects, I see it, you see it, there is no ambiguity here. Just naming a physical object. Wittgenstein's theory, which is accurate, ends up sacrificing so much rigor that, in fact, it may not even be able to crack this simple problem. So I will go to that passage. All right. I'm actually just going to read a long passage from Philosophical Investigations. He says it better than I do. But what, for example, is the word this, the name of, in language game, or the word that, in the ostensive definition, that is called? If you do not want to produce confusion, you will do best not to call these words names at all. Yet, strange to say, the word this has been called the only genuine name, so that anything else we call a name was one only in an inexact, approximate sense. This queer conception springs from a tendency to sublime the logic of our language, as one might put it. The proper answer to it is, we call very different things names. The word name is used to characterize many different kinds of use of a word, related to one another in many different ways, but the kind of use that this has is not among them. It is quite true that, in giving an ostensive definition, for instance, we often point to the object named and say the name. And similarly, in giving an ostensive definition, for instance, we say the word this while pointing to a thing. And also the word this and a name often occupy the same position in a sentence. but is precisely characteristic of a name that is defined by means of the demonstrative expression that is n, or that is called n. But do we also give the definitions that is called this, or this is called this? This is connected with the conception of naming as, so to speak, an occult process. Naming appears as a queer connection of a word with an object. And you really get such a queer connection when the philosopher tries to bring out the relation between name and thing by staring at an object in front of him and repeating a name or even the word this innumerable times. For philosophical problems arise when language goes on holiday. And here we may indeed fancy naming to be some remarkable act of mind, as it were a baptism of an object. And we can also say the word this to the object, as it were address the object as this, a queer use of the word, which doubtless only occurs in doing philosophy. In a similar way to, that's the end of the passage, in a similar way to how Quine talked about words being defined in terms of each other, how a full dictionary would not be a satisfactory method of rigorizing a language since words are always defined in terms of each other. Wittgenstein takes that and puts that into the human context and says that when we put a name on an object, we're saying that one specific example, one specific object bears that name, and it is still up to another vague language game. You're only pushing the problem back to determine which objects are so similar to this example object as to bear the same name. I like the analogy of it's a baptism of an object, of a specific object. But when we point to an object and name it something, we are not defining the word in any way more rigorous than as we define any other word, which is vaguely through language games, through trial and error, through shared understanding, and not through any objective rigorous process. Naming an object, something we would like our theory of language to do, should it be rigorous and satisfactory, again, it just gets reduced to another vague process of two humans, talking to each other until they come to a shared understanding of what a dog is. There are some vague examples where naming something, isn't enough, even if the people have interacted with each other and interacted with the object thousands of times. A good example is there was a soccer game where a player was passed the ball when the goalie of the opposing team was in front of him, but another defender was behind him. And the two commentators, who had both seen thousands of soccer games and watched offside calls, disagreed about what was offsides. One said, the goalie's in front of him, and there's at most one defender behind him, and so he's onside. And the other person would say, no, there's at least one defender behind him. It happens not to be the goalie, but he's still a defender. And so he's onside. I'm sorry, that first one should have been offside. These two people had seen the same object thousands and thousands of times, yet though their definition of offside was 99.9% effective and they could converse and they played the game correctly, the language game, it still failed them. This messy human game ended up resulting in different definitions of offside for them. I believe the second guy ended up being right in terms of the rule book, but the language game involved with naming an object, something so simple, was still not fully rigorous. It still just relied on human relativistic interaction. And so that's kind of the state of the art now. I don't think in modern philosophy, and this is something I may do in continuing this project, I don't think modern philosophy is really trying to fully rigorize the words humans use. I think we've kind of accepted that that's something that's just mathematical, and even math deep down is something relative and not Platonic, but to try and take our language and rigorize it in any practical way or any way that makes it worth studying is going to be kind of a failed experiment. And so these were some big results, some influential results that followed the incompleteness theorems and kind of threw an entire nihilistic shade on projects of rigorizing things. It failed in math, and it failed here. Two Dogmas of Empiricism by Quine was called one of the most influential papers in 20th century philosophy. Philosophical Investigations is as well. They both come to kind of startling conclusions, which is that we can never escape the messiness of language, and as precise as we would like to be, we cannot be precise. But there's something a little bit calming about that. We're not cleaving at some perfect conception of language, and our language is as good as we are. We're not being ambiguous or messy. We're just doing the best we can, and it's always going to be ambiguous and messy.